We're continuing on our journey through the terms that define the video standards we use today. In this nugget, we'll cover aspect ratio, pixels, color standards, and analog to digital conversion. Here we go. Next up in our video dictionary is the aspect ratio, which describes essentially the size and shape of your video. May sound a little crazy, but if you've ever gone shopping for a TV, you ever notice there's no circle TVs or wavy TVs or oval TVs? They're all one of two things. They're either almost square, and those are the ones you typically find at the garage sales that people are getting rid of, right? Grandma's TV. Or they're rectangles. Those are our widescreen. And that really represents the two mainstream video formats or aspect ratios of today. 4:3, which is our standard. Those are the old almost square televisions, and 16:9, which is our HD or widescreen television. Now this doesn't really map up to 4 inches by 3 inches or 4 centimeters by 3. It's just a ratio, right? For every 4 lengths that you go or widths that you go 3 heights, and that's what gives you the perspective. You've probably all at some point had a picture on your phone or a background that you downloaded for your computer and you wanted it to fill the whole screen, so you uncheck the little box that says maintain aspect ratio, and your beautiful daughter suddenly stretches across the screen and you're like, ugh! It's because it didn't fit the aspect ratio of the screen. That's why it's so important to adhere to that. Next up is the pixel, which represents the smallest controllable element of a picture. Just think of your monitor. Look at your monitor right now as an army of millions. And each one of those army members can hold up a big card that is either red, green, or blue, right? And your computer at any given point in time is yelling out instructions to all these millions of army men to hold up red, green, blue, all those kind of things. Matter of fact, if you take a look at this, I actually took my iPhone. I created this slide right here. Took my iPhone and took a zoomed in picture of it. I zoomed in as far as it would go. And you can see right here, it's small, especially if you're watching me on an iPhone or mobile device or something like that. Good grief. Just take my word for it. There are all these little squares, and if you look really, really close, if you try so hard, you can see that each one of them is this little rectangle of 3 different colors. Again, red, green, and blue. And you remember from your art classes when you're a kid that you can mix those things together to make just about any color that you can. So essentially, anytime we are sending images, part of video, to the screen, they are being represented with pixels, and the more pixels you have, the better quality image you're going to end up with. You've probably seen a low resolution picture that has jagged edges and things like that, and that's just because you don't have enough of these little army men, these little squares, to represent it small enough to where the human eye can't perceive it. Okay. We now have enough of these individual video elements to comprise the video format, which is a combination of all of these different things. So if I'm talking about video format for an old CRT monitor, 4:3 example, I might say, oh, well, that's a 720 by 576 50i, or essentially 25 frames per second, right? Because that is 50 interlaced, or fields per second. You'll see it written as 576i, right? That's kind of a shorthand notation for it. But what does that mean? Well, when you're looking at these resolutions, this represents the number of pixels going across your monitor, right? So if you take these represent the scan lines, or essentially how many lines go across that display, 576 of them, each one of those scan lines having 720 dots, right, or pixels inside of it. So if I were to say, well, how many pixels are represented on that monitor, I could bust out my calculator, do a 720 by 576. So that display would have 414,000 pixels making up an image that would be displayed on there. And that image, we would actually stream 25 images every single second, right, to comprise the video. Yeah? Not too bad when you think about it, right? Yeah, so 16 by 9, there's our widescreen display, or our HD display. 920 width by 1080 height, 30p. So that's our progressive video format. You'll see it written a lot of times as 1080p when you're talking about essentially the height of the screen, number of scan lines, times the resolutions, or the progressive resolution of 30 frames per second. So let's bust that out. How many pixels are on that display? 1920 times 1080. 2,073 I don't know what, 2,073,600, which, by the way, you might often see written 2.0 megapixel. Oh, I love doing that, where it's like all of it. It's like at the end of a good movie. He's dead. I didn't know that. The whole movie, that guy was dead. So anyway, 2.0 megapixel is essentially the highest resolution that display can give you, based on the number of pixels on the screen, right? But is it all coming together now? I know when you're talking about the individual elements, it's like, but then when you finally see the video format, it starts sounding a little more familiar. All right, last video specific term. I know your brain's turning to mush. Hang with me. It's color standards, right? Primarily talking about NTSC and PAL. At least that's the ones that are the most familiar in my mind when I think about color standards. These were the standards that were developed as we made that transition from black and white television into the new generation of color TV. How do you transmit colors and all those kind of things? That was dictated by these standards that were developed. Now, the United States was first to the game and created NTSC. Europe followed shortly thereafter with phase alternating line. But these dictated how many visible lines were actually seen on the television screen and how it was able to handle color. It also dictated standards for vertical blank intervals, VBI or V-blank. So imagine your TV, right? You actually see 480, I'm talking United States right now, 480 scan lines that are active on the screen. But believe it or not, outside of that little frame, there's that black bar that you can see. It's outside of your visible area, that is used for things like closed caption, teletext, time codes, test signals, that you can actually send those things down to the television set using essentially the bandwidth of the video broadcast. But it's not actually, you're not seeing gibberish going across the bottom of your screen, because it's always outside of the visible areas. So the TV manufacturers would design their televisions to be either NTSC or PAL compliant. There was also, and this, by the way, pulled that from Wikipedia, gives you a visual of where NTSC and PAL standards were, as well as CCAM. CCAM is just another PAL. Right? It's just a different standard. Actually gets into the Cold War era. The government didn't want people picking up PAL signals from Europe, so they developed their own little standard and said, okay, all the televisions manufactured are going to be CCAM compliant, so you can't watch these broadcasts going on in Europe and things like that. Isn't that funny? Wars dictate technology standards for television. So nonetheless, those are the different color standards that were developed. Nowadays, we don't usually talk about them in terms of scan lines. We talk about them in terms of pixels, like I was describing on the previous slide. Finally, let's talk about digital versus analog. Analog will always be around. I'll tell you why in just a second, but it essentially is a method of transmitting data that relies on physical, tangible stuff, because you can use analog transmission for so many things. I think the most common example of analog is the old tin can and strings, where you've got somebody speaking into the tin can on one end, and literally the vibration of air is hitting that tin can, vibrating the bottom of it with sound waves, and as long as you keep this string tight, that vibration passes along that string, ending up vibrating the bottom of this can in the same way, allowing the other person to hear the speaker coming through the tin can and strings, right? Very rudimentary example, but demonstrates exactly how just about every analog transmission works. Matter of fact, right now, I'm talking to you through a headset. Now, I'm speaking analog. I live in a digital age, right? But I am still a human being. I'm still causing air vibrations to occur coming out of my mouth, and whoever manufactured this microphone that's picking up my voice right now has essentially a mechanical device in there that's bouncing back and forth, doing the same thing that this tin can would do, but in a much more sophisticated and accurate way, and converting my voice into electrical signal, right? Because electrical signal's a lot more resistant to interference than a tin can and strings. Although it would be interesting to try and do a recording using a tin can and strings. Well, again, same thing, analog transmission. The reason I floundered for a second there and just said stuff is because you use it for digital television as well and video broadcasting, sending airwaves of essentially mechanical transmissions that your television with the bunny ear would pick up and convert back into something that you're able to see on the screen. Now, the problem with analog, always the problem with analog, is you're going to get interference. Tin can and strings, you can't go very far, right? Because that string can't accurately represent those vibrations too far because it loses it through the tightness of the string, through a variety of different things. Same thing with electrical signal. I mean, think about the bunny ears. Come on. I know I'm talking to people that are my age that had bunny ears on their TV, right? And you would watch the screen and all of a sudden go and get all fuzzy and you're like, oh, and you'd run up and try and adjust the bunny ears so you can see the Olympics or whatever you're trying to watch because it was being interfered with by the different things in the air. Well, that's why digital is the preferred method of transmission for any length of time. Essentially, what analog requires is a continuous signal. Like if the airwaves stop broadcasting the television signal or someone stops talking, right? It goes silent because there's no more signal to replicate through. Well, in digital, digital takes this continuous signal and stores it as ones and zeros. Now, I say ones and zeros just because that's binary. At the lowest language that a computer can speak is an on and off. But those ones and zeros represent numbers that can be used to accurately recalculate the signal. So maybe this is a representing an electric signal that could be a phone call. It could be a television broadcast. Essentially what we do is sample that signal every X amount of time on whatever scale, and whatever scale you choose dictates the kind of encoding you're using and things like that. But you use a scale to say, okay, well, it looks like at time interval 1, which could be 50 milliseconds into the transmission, whatever we're digitizing has a value of 1. And then when we got to 100 milliseconds, it had a value of 2. So it takes this smooth kind of waveform of analog and converts it to numbers. Once you have those numbers, you can extend that transmission over whatever distance you want without interference. Why? You're just sending numbers. You're not trying to keep this waveform accurate through whatever kind of interference, through however loose that string could be or whatever fluorescent light you might pass along the way, right? We're just sending numbers. I love doing this. I call my mom. She just tells me to, every time I do this, she's like, shut up. But I'm like, Mom, did you know that you're not really hearing me right now? Now, this is early on when I first started doing this. I do this about once a month. And she's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, you're hearing numbers that are actually representing my voice. But when I started explaining to her voice over IP and how it all works, and about halfway through she's like, well, whatever, Jeremy, you're anyway, you see what I mean, right? So these numbers represent values on this waveform that we can accurately reconstruct at the other end. At the end of the day, we have to use analog something to get it back to us, right? If I'm sitting here talking into a telephone, I may digitize my voice, but it started as analog, became digital, and then had to play out to my ear as sound waves, so it had to go back to analog. Or watching a broadcast, you have to convert that back into something that you can see, physical colors, all those kind of things. That's the difference. Analog will always be around, but digital is best for transmitting the data over long distances. You've now rounded out your library of the core terms used in the video standard world. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.